It's an industry that most Canadians have no idea exists because it's quite small, it's quite niche. There's only a handful of exporters who send horses outside of the country for slaughter. But when people do hear about it, they're appalled. And as you just mentioned, horses occupy a really special place in people's hearts and their psyches. And we have a really long shared history as humans with horses. They've been by our side through industrial processes, through wars for a long time. And I think most people feel that they really deserve a lot better than what they're getting. So, what's happening is we've got about 4 to 5 exporters in Canada who purpose breed horses. So, these are essentially factory farmed horses. They're not bought from auctions, they're not shipped across the border from the States. They're purpose bred to go into the farming system. They're raised on feedlots in Canada, and once they reach a couple years of age, they're shipped in large cargo planes, packed tightly into tiny wooden crates, 2 or 3 at a time. First they're transported from the feedlot to an airport. The shipments go these days either from the Edmonton airport or from the Winnipeg airport. And they load them into these crates at the airport. They, put them in with cargo devices inside the planes. And then they endure these really grueling hours long journeys, 14 hours or more, in the air to Japan. Once they land, they repeat that process. They're unloaded onto trucks. They're shipped to quarantine facilities where they spend some time in quarantine. And then eventually they go to a feedlot where they're fattened up and they're prepared for slaughter. And they're slaughtered. Their meat is eaten by rich Japanese people who consider it to be a delicacy. It's called basashi, and it's essentially a form of sashimi. And it can fetch a very, very handsome price, hundreds of pounds. And, just one shipment of horses for, a Canadian exporter, they can sell that shipment of around 100 horses for over $1 million. So it's very, very lucrative.
Yeah, I had actually never heard that they ate horses in Japan. I mean, I never heard that they didn't, but it was not a thing I was aware of. So why are they shipped live?
Well, they're shipped live because Canadian exporters are in the business of raising these horses, and it seems to be that there's an efficiency for Japanese slaughterhouses that want to sell them. Yeah, it's a little bit strange why they wouldn't do it in Japan, but that's the industry we've got, and so we've got these horses who are enduring these really, really tragic, terrible journeys where a lot of them suffer horrific injuries. Many of them die en route or shortly thereafter. And the other thing that's really tragic about this is well, two things. We know, first of all, that a lot of these shipments go well over the 28-hour time limit allowed under Canadian transport law. And we'll get into that because that's really one of the issues
Yeah,
in this
that's a
case.
big issue. Yeah.
Yeah, but we also know that they really do suffer horrific injuries that are often unreported to Canadian authorities. So Canada kind of washes its hands of this industry. It says once the horses are land in Japan, that's no longer their responsibility. So they stop tracking the time it takes for them to get to the feedlots. And we determined through access to information records from some Japanese groups that we've worked with, we've determined that many of these shipments are going well, well over the time limit. And that when horses land and they're taken to quarantines and feedlots, many of them are suffering from fevers, from pneumonia, from serious injuries. Many have fallen in the crates. And, probably around a dozen or so horses per year actually die as well. And none of these deaths or injuries are reflected in Canada's records.
Yeah, it's so interesting, like that. I thought you were going to have an answer to why they are shipped live, but the reason is basically is because that's how the industry kind of got developed, and there was an opportunity, and somebody grabbed it, and this was the easiest way to do it. And I thought you were going to tell me they had to be, the Japanese insisted on them being slaughtered in Japan. Like it's crazy. This could at least, I mean, I'm not that I'm in favor of them being slaughtered at all, but they could either be slaughtered in Canada and the meat shipped, or they could be raised in Japan and slaughtered there. It's just people just do things the easiest way and don't even pay any attention to so many of the implications. All right, so there is a legal regime, and you mentioned, which I think is interesting, that Canada does have responsibility for the horses, some kind of responsibility until the plane lands. It's not like the Canadian responsibility totally ends when they get on the plane. It is until the plane lands in Japan. So can you tell us a little bit about the legal regime covering these horse exports? It's covered by basically regulatory laws that cover the transport of animals, right?
Yeah, that's right, Marianne. So what's interesting to me about working on this case is that we're very used to farmed animals just not having any laws that apply to them.
Yeah.
Their entire
Yeah.
lives on farms are just left unregulated in
Yeah.
Canada. We don't have a single regulatory statute that says anything about the welfare conditions they should experience. But transport is a different area. There actually are animal transport laws. Many people would say they're insufficient. I'm one of those people, but they're quite detailed and there are some requirements that have to be met. Now, one of the most basic requirements is that you are not allowed to transport horses for more than 28 hours without food, without water, or without rest. That's a really fundamental obligation, and it exists because we know that the risks to horses go up the longer they're transported. They risk dehydration, they risk hunger, they risk disease and injury from long duration journeys. So those rules exist for a good reason. One of the other fundamental obligations that transporters have, and that's the real crux of this case, is that they have an obligation to have a contingency plan to cover the entire journey that a horse or any other animal who's being transported has to take. So, what's a contingency plan? It's a document designed to deal with unforeseen but foreseeable delays. So, you look at what could possibly go wrong during a journey, and you as a transporter are supposed to plan for that. So, if there is transport by truck, maybe the truck breaks down. What do you do if the truck breaks down? Do you have another truck that can be called in to pick up the animals and take them to an appropriate location? If you are transporting animals by air, what do you do if there's a delay with an airport closure en route? And that's what happened in this case, and we'll get into that. But that's the nature of things that the contingency plan is supposed to cover. So there are really fundamental obligations that you have to follow if you're transporting animals.
So, who enforces these laws? Tell us about the Canadian agency in charge of, I guess, not just these kinds of exports, but a variety of different issues regarding animals.
Yeah, so they're called the Canadian Food Inspection Agency, and because most of your listeners are probably in the States, they're equivalent essentially to the USDA. They oversee farmed animal issues, they oversee food safety, they have a really significant role in animal and human health as well, and they're the ones in charge of enforcing these transport rules. And they actually have inspectors that are fairly closely involved at a number of different levels of horse transport. So the Japanese government has requirements that must be met before horses are transported. They need blood tests, they need health assurances. There's a variety of documentation that exporters are supposed to provide to Japan. And the CFIA kind of intermediates this process. They go do those tests. They're paid by the exporter to do that. And that information is shared with Japan. And when the horses are actually taken to the airport, and I'll refer to Winnipeg because we're talking about a case out of
Sure.
Manitoba, which Winnipeg was the airport in question. When the horses are transported from the feedlot to the Winnipeg airport, they're there at the airport as well. And ostensibly, their job is to ensure that transport laws are being respected and that all the boxes are being ticked and the transport is complying with the regulatory requirements. Now, the CFIA, I'm sure, like the USDA, is vulnerable to criticism. We don't believe that they do a very good job
It's nicely
of
put.
enforcing. Yeah, nicely put. We don't believe that they've done a very effective job of enforcing these transportation regulations or many other regulations for that matter. But we'll get into that a little bit more as well.
Yeah. So, who pays? I mean, you mentioned that the exporter has to pay for tests that the CFIA conducts, but this is a pretty expensive proposition to do all these inspections. I understand they even go on the planes. Is that correct? And who's paying them? Is it the Canadian citizens, or are there fees to the exporter that they have to pay for all of this work done by the CFIA? Either way, there's a problematic situation, I think. But so tell me the way it really is.
Well, I think what you're identifying, Marianne, is what we think is the problem with the CFIA, as is the case with many regulatory agencies, which is regulatory capture.
Yeah.
They work so closely with the industries that they ostensibly oversee. They develop personal relationships with the people that they're overseeing. And I think that really interferes with their ability to enforce laws properly. That's at sort of the micro level, and you can see that play out potentially with this farm. But at the macro level as well, they're an agency that works within a department that's both tasked with agricultural promotion. They're supposed to assure the health of the industry, they're supposed to facilitate the industry doing exports, but they're also supposed to oversee the industry. They're supposed to police it and make sure it follows the rules. And I think with that conflict of interest, you get a situation where there's regulatory capture, and the CFIA ends up working for the exporters rather than the public interest and the interest of the horses, of course, which is what we care about.
Yeah, and even if there was distance and they had an antagonistic relationship, then it would be that the Canadian citizens were paying for this horse export examination government behavior, which would be a boon to the industry anyway. It seems like there's no good way to do this, which there isn't. So
No, it is an inherently cruel activity.